Throughout history, the difference between the Philistines and the Palestinians has been a subject of much debate and confusion. However, when we look closely at the lessons from God through the biblical passages, we can clearly see the differences not only historically, but also spiritually and morally. The Philistines, an ancient people who feature prominently in biblical stories such as the confrontation with King Saul and the war with the Israelites, are often portrayed as enemies of God's people. They lived in fortified cities and idolized material values and the power of war. In contrast, the modern Palestinians have a complex relationship with their land and heritage, tied to historical and political challenges. The lesson from God is not only a historical distinction, but also a reminder of the need for peace, kindness, and forgiveness in our lives, especially in the face of conflict and division. Number 1. Overcoming challenges. Lessons from the conflict between Israel and the Philistines. In biblical history, the stories of the Philistines and the Israelites have always been a vivid demonstration of the wars not only between peoples, but also between faiths and spiritual values. This story not only brings lessons about war and conflict, but also warnings about the power of steadfastness in faith and the power of God. Geographical location and lifetime of the Philistines. The Philistines lived mainly along the coastal region of Canaan, the area that we today call Gaza, Ashkelon, Ashdod, Ekron, and Gath. This location is located in the southwest of Canaan, on the Mediterranean coast, a place where war and clashes between civilizations have always been an indispensable part of history. Origin and relationship with the Sea People. According to archaeological research, the Philistines may have been part of the ethnic group known as the Sea Peoples. This was a confederation of tribes originating from the Aegean region, especially from islands such as Crete and lands around the Mediterranean. Around 1200 BC, they migrated to the Canaan region, began to occupy coastal areas, creating confrontations with the indigenous peoples, including the Israelites. Philistine military power and weapons. One of the factors that helped the Philistines stand out was their advanced military technology and the use of iron weapons. This gave them a distinct military advantage over other peoples in the region, especially the Israelites, who had not yet widely used iron. The Philistines not only possessed sharp weapons such as swords, spears, and shields, but also possessed highly effective fighting tools. One of the Philistines' special weapons was the war chariot. These chariots allowed them to move quickly across the flat coastal plains, increasing the pressure in battles and becoming an essential factor in warfare. The Philistine religion and the confrontation with Israel. One of the reasons the Philistines became enemies of Israel was their religious differences. The Philistines were polytheists, worshipping gods such as Dagon, Baal, and Ashtoreth. Meanwhile, the Israelites worshipped only one God, Yahweh. This opposition not only led to wars, but also conflicts of faith and morality. The worship of foreign gods and the rituals that accompanied them made the Philistines a direct challenge to God's power and presence over the people of Israel. This led to many battles in the Bible where the Philistines fought not only to defend their power, but also to oppose God's majesty. Conflict between the Philistines and Israel. The conflict between Israel and the Philistines is an important part of biblical history, especially in the Old Testament. These conflicts were not just ordinary wars, but also profound lessons in faith and patience. Among the famous battles, it is impossible not to mention the confrontation between David and Goliath, 1 Samuel chapter 17, verse 13. This battle was not only a military victory, but also a spiritual victory. When an unarmed young man defeated a giant warrior thanks to his steadfast faith in God. Although the Philistines possessed clear military advantages, in many biblical stories, they were often defeated by God's intervention. This showed that no matter how powerful the enemy was, all power must eventually be subdued by God. A clear example is the story of the Philistines capturing the Ark of the Covenant from Israel, 1 Samuel chapter 5. They brought the Ark of the Covenant back and placed it in the temple of their god Dagon. However, God intervened, causing Dagon to fall face down on the Ark of the Covenant, and all the Philistines' plans failed. A lesson in faith and resilience. The confrontation between the Philistines and the Israelites was not only a military battle, but also a lesson in faith, resilience, and dependence on God. The Israelites, although militarily weaker, always won because they trusted in God's guidance. The story of David and Goliath is a testament to the victory of faith in God, that when we put our trust in Him, He will fight for us. This was not only a military victory, but also a spiritual victory, when God showed that he would always protect his people from all evil forces. The end of the Philistines. After many conflicts, the Philistines were finally defeated and their region fell to the great empires, ending their existence as an independent people. The fall of the Philistines was a testament to the absolute power of God, that those who defied him would eventually face justice and punishment. Number 2. God's triumph. Lessons from the Philistines. The Philistines, Israel's formidable enemies in the Bible, represented not only military opposition, but also challenges and resistance to God's power. Yet, through the stories that emerge, we see clearly that God is never defeated, and that he always intervenes to protect his people, even in seemingly impossible situations. Samson, one of Israel's most famous judges, is a clear example of how God works through people. While still in his mother's womb, Samson was chosen by God to deliver Israel from Philistine oppression. His life was filled with extraordinary victories through God's supernatural strength. One of the most memorable battles was when he used a donkey jawbone to defeat 1,000 Philistine soldiers, a victory that not only demonstrated Samson's strength, but also the presence of God in his battle. However, the climax of Samson's life was not only in his military victories, but in the final moment when, imprisoned and humiliated by the Philistines, he asked God for strength one last time. In the temple of Dagon, amid the mocking laughter and arrogance of his enemies, Samson brought down the temple, killing thousands of Philistines. This event was not only a victory for Samson, but also an affirmation that the God of Israel was above all gods, including Dagon. God's power humbled the arrogance of his enemies and protected his name among the nations. Another figure associated with God's victory over the Philistines was David, who was later chosen to be king. When Goliath, a giant Philistine warrior, challenged the entire army of Israel, no one dared to stand up to him. But David, a shepherd boy with strong faith in God, volunteered to confront Goliath. Without a sword or armor, David only needed a slingshot and a stone to defeat the giant. This was not only David's victory, but also the victory of faith in God. Through this event, God demonstrated that strength and victory do not come from weapons or people, but from himself. With God's intervention, seemingly insurmountable challenges become possible. The story of David and Goliath also reminds us that, in our weakest moments, when facing great enemies, God is still our refuge and our only source of strength. For David, a small stone became a tool to demonstrate God's great power. Through it, God not only protected Israel, but also affirmed that he is the only powerful one worthy of worship. Another event that clearly demonstrated God's power was when the Philistines captured the Ark of the Covenant. During the battle at Ebenezer, the Israelite army was defeated, and the Ark of the Covenant, the symbol of God's presence, was taken by the Philistines. This loss was a tremendous spiritual shock to Israel, and the Philistines saw it as proof that their God was more powerful than the God of Israel. But they were wrong. As soon as the Ark of the Covenant was brought into the temple of Dagon in Ashdod, strange things happened. The statue of Dagon kept falling before the Ark of the Covenant, even breaking off its head and arms. Also, disaster befell the Philistines in the form of plagues and boils. The presence of the Ark of the Covenant became an unbearable burden for the Philistines. They tried to move the Ark of the Covenant to other cities, but wherever the Ark of the Covenant was taken, disaster followed. Eventually, the Philistines had to acknowledge God's power. They decided to return the Ark of the Covenant to Israel, along with the sin offerings, including the golden idols. This act was not only a surrender, but also a recognition that the God of Israel was almighty, surpassing all their gods. This event marked another important victory, not only the recovery of the Ark of the Covenant, but also the affirmation that God never fails to protect his name and his people. The stories of Samson, David, and the Ark of the Covenant are not only historical events in the Bible, but also contain valuable lessons for us today. First, they demonstrate that God is always on the side of his people, even in the most difficult circumstances. He is the one who never abandons them, constantly intervening to protect and rescue his people from the hands of their enemies. Second, these stories teach us that true strength comes not from men or weapons, but from the presence and power of God. Samson could not have defeated the Philistines on his own without God's help. David could not have defeated Goliath without his faith in God. And Israel could not have recovered the Ark of the Covenant without God's supernatural intervention. Finally, these stories remind us that no matter how difficult our circumstances, we can always rely on God. He is our strength, refuge, and source of hope in every trial. Through his victories over the Philistines, God affirmed that he is all-powerful, the King of Kings, and that no deity or enemy can stand against him. Looking back on these events, we are reminded of God's faithfulness and power. He not only intervened in the history of Israel, but he is also at work in our lives today. Our trials, whether big or small, can become opportunities for God to demonstrate his power and faithfulness. The question is not how strong we are, but whether we are willing to surrender our lives to God. For only in him can we find true victory. Number 3. Lost Journey, the story of the Philistines. The history of the Philistines, a once powerful people of the southern coastal region of Canaan, is a profound lesson in the decline of a nation in the face of great empires. Although they had a strong culture, the Philistines gradually disappeared from the world under the attack of great historical forces. Their decline is a warning of what can happen when a people no longer holds on to their beliefs and identity. The Philistines, one of the long-term opponents of the biblical Israelites, were once a powerful people living in famous cities such as Gaza, Ashkelon, Ashdod, Ekron, and Gath. In the 6th century BC, as the Babylonian Empire under King Nebuchadnezzar II expanded, the cities of Philistia could not resist their power. This was a major turning point in the history of Israel. This Philistine is the one that is called Behold, and is evoked in text of the story of Philistis when these cities were not only captured but also destroyed. During this period, the Babylonian Empire carried out brutal conquests. It was not only a military war, but also a strategy of social and cultural change. The cities of Philistia, including Ashkelon, were completely destroyed in 604 BC. The surviving inhabitants were taken prisoner and taken to Babylon, where they were forced to assimilate into Babylonian culture. This not only weakened the Philistines militarily, but also caused them to lose their cultural identity. Socially and economically, after the conquest of Babylon, the Philistines faced a completely new life. They no longer had autonomy, and their culture was replaced by the culture of the great empires such as Babylon and later Persia. The cultural mixing and imposition of these civilizations gradually eroded the identity of the Philistines. The remains of this period are mainly architectural works and archaeological objects. But there was no longer a Philistine community as before. Not only that, the Philistines also faced another major challenge in their history: the change of the name of the land. In 135 AD, after the Bar Kokhba revolt, the Roman Emperor Hadrian decided to change the name of Judea to Palestina. This decision was not only political in nature but also aimed at erasing traces of the Jews and their land, to prevent future uprisings. What is special is that the name Palestina was taken from Philistia, the former land of the Philistines. This was an act of great political and cultural significance, as the Romans used this name to continue erasing traces of ancient cultures in the area. This name change not only blurred the connection between the Jews and their land, but also accelerated the Romanization of the region, which further obscured Philistine culture. By the time the Roman Empire came to power, the Philistines had ceased to exist as a distinct people. Subsequent empires such as Persia, Greece, and Rome had extinguished all traces of this people. The Philistines no longer existed as a separate community, and their identity was no longer mentioned in texts or legends. What remained of them were material remains such as architectural works, pottery, and archaeological artifacts. The decline of the Philistines teaches us an essential lesson about historical change and the role of great empires in shaping the world. The Philistines, in their initial strength, were unable to withstand powerful forces and were gradually forgotten. Their disappearance was not only the end of a people, but also a reminder of the fragility of power and the need to preserve cultural identity in a changing world. Although lost as a distinct people, the Philistine legacy lives on in archaeological remains and the pages of biblical history. The wars between the Israelites and the Philistines, the stories of Samson, Goliath, and other confrontations remain essential lessons in the struggle between good and evil, between justice and violence. The Philistines, though lost to the course of history, left a deep mark on the hearts of those who believe in God. In this lesson, we realize that the decline of a people is not just an end, but also part of the grand plan that God has for the peoples. The fall of Philistia, as well as the restoration of Israel, were part of a prophecy that God gave to his people long ago. Ultimately, the fall of Philistia is not a meaningless end, but a lesson in resilience, restoration, and the survival of spiritual values in all circumstances. God will always protect and restore those who believe in him, just as he protected and restored the Israelites through the centuries. Remember that the fall of a nation is not the end, but an opportunity for profound lessons from history to be passed on to future generations. Number 4. The quest for peace, Palestinians in the new era. When we look at the history and present of the Palestinian people, we see a complex story of faith, conflict, and hope. Although the name Palestine dates back to the Roman period, modern Palestinians are not the ancient Philistines we read about in the Bible. In fact, today's Palestinians are Arabs, mostly Sunni Muslims, with a small Christian population. The term Palestine came into everyday use during the British Mandate period, when the area became part of the British Empire after World War I, following the dissolution of the Ottoman Empire. Before that, the area had no independent state but was part of the Ottoman Empire. The name Palestine is widely used, but it is the contemporary Palestinians who are attached to this land, who have begun to build a distinct national identity. The change this became even more evident when the Zionist movement began to increase the Jewish presence in the region, and the British Balfour Declaration of 1917 created an important milestone in the creation of a national state for the Jewish people in Palestine. This created strong reactions from the Palestinian Arabs, and from there a Palestinian national movement began to form. This movement became a symbol of Palestinian patriotism and aspirations for freedom. When the State of Israel was established in 1948, the region of Palestine was divided and the conflict broke out. The Palestinians began to see themselves as a people with the right to self-determination, fighting not only for their existence, but also for their independence in the land they considered their homeland. This war lasted for decades, and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict continues to this day. To this day, Palestinians live not only in the West Bank, Gaza, or Israel, but also scattered in other countries such as Jordan, Lebanon, and Syria. Many Palestinians live in refugee camps, a result of the wars and land displacement that followed 1948. Although the number of Palestinian Christians has declined in recent years due to displacement and harsh social conditions, they remain a significant presence, particularly in cities such as Bethlehem, Ramallah, and East Jerusalem. Modern Palestinian society is divided into Muslim and Christian communities. Muslims, mainly Sunnis, make up the majority of the population and live mainly in the West Bank and Gaza. Meanwhile, the Christian community, although no longer as large as it once was, still plays an important role in the social and cultural life of Palestinian cities. The political landscape of Palestine today is complex and volatile. The Palestinian Authority administers the West Bank, while Hamas, an Islamist political and militant group, controls Gaza. This conflict has created deep divisions within Palestinian society, and the long-standing conflict between political factions has exacerbated tensions. The Israeli-Palestinian conflict remains a major issue in global politics. The disputes over Palestinian territorial rights, self-determination, and statehood remain unresolved. Palestinians today continue to aspire to an independent state, an internationally recognized state, and a future of peace and freedom. Pain, loss, and conflict have left a deep mark on the Palestinian people. But even in that hardship, their hope and perseverance never fade. They continue to fight for their rights and freedom, believing in a brighter future. The Palestinians' quest for peace is not only a story of suffering, but also a journey of courage, faith, and hope. In a world filled with instability and conflict, the Palestinian story is a reminder of the desire for peace, justice, and freedom, values that we must protect and cherish. Number 5. The Israel-Palestine conflict, prophecy and the mission of peace. The Israel-Palestine conflict, which has lasted for decades, is not only a story about land disputes, but also an essential part of the history and prophecy of the Bible. From the early days of the Zionist movement to the bloody wars, the prophecies of the promised land of Canaan still call to souls yearning for peace and justice. The historical struggle for land and self-determination. This conflict began in the late 19th century, when the Zionist movement was formed with the goal of re-establishing a Jewish state on the land of their ancestors. However, Throughout this process, the Palestinian people have lived and are deeply attached to this land, creating a dispute not only about land, but also about national identity. In 1947, the United Nations proposed a plan to partition Palestine into two states, a Jewish state and an Arab state, with Jerusalem as an international city. However, this plan was not accepted by the Palestinians and the Arab countries, and in 1948, when Israel declared independence, the Arab countries immediately opposed it, and the war between Israel and these countries broke out. Israel won, conquering more land than initially planned, forcing hundreds of thousands of Palestinians to flee and become refugees. But the story does not end there. The Palestinians, with the desire to restore their autonomy and establish a state of their own, continued to fight. They see the establishment of a Palestinian state as a fundamental, undeniable right. In their eyes, this is not only a fight for rights, but also a fight for honor and justice. The Palestinian Authority and Hamas, an internal divide. Currently, the Palestinian Authority administers the West Bank, which was established after the Oslo agreements in the 1990s, led by President Mahmoud Abbas. However, the Gaza Strip fell into the hands of Hamas in 2007 after an internal conflict between Hamas and Fatah. Hamas, an extremist Islamist organization, refuses to recognize Israel's right to exist and regularly carries out rocket attacks. This creates a complex picture where on one side is the Palestinian Authority with some hope for peace, while on the other side is Hamas with the goal of destroying Israel. This situation makes the path to peace more difficult than ever. Zionism and Arab nationalism, two sides of a war. Since the 19th century, the Zionist movement has flourished, with the desire to restore a Jewish state in the land of Israel, also known as Canaan in the Bible. After the Holocaust in World War II, the movement received strong support from the international community, and in 1948 the State of Israel was officially established. This was a great victory for the Jews, but also a painful turning point for the Palestinians, who saw the emergence of Israel as an invasion and a seizure of their land. Meanwhile, Arab nationalism, especially among the Palestinians, saw the liberation of Palestine and the re-establishment of a Palestinian state as its primary goal. The irreconcilable differences between these two movements created a conflict not only over land, but also over the survival and self-determination of each people. Prophecy and the importance of peace. From the Bible, especially the prophetic books, we see a clear connection between these conflicts and the prophecies about the promised land of Canaan. These upheavals are not just the result of political strife, but are also events that have long predicted an end time when all peoples and nations will be brought before God's justice. With the prophecies in Ezekiel, Daniel, and Revelation, we are reminded that this conflict is not accidental, but part of God's plan. No matter how deep the divisions, ultimate peace can only be built when all peoples realize that only God can bring us reconciliation. However, the road to peace is not easy. God has taught that nations and peoples who do not repent and seek forgiveness will face His justice. But for those who repent and seek reconciliation, God is always willing to give them the opportunity to restore their relationship with Him and with each other. Ultimately, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is not just a political story, but also a lesson in patience, forgiveness, and the power of love in difficult times. While we find prophecies of peace in the Bible, we also need to understand that peace begins in the heart of each person. If each believer realizes that land and nation are merely instruments in God's hands, then the peace we seek will not be far away. And so, this conflict, as long and complicated as it is not the end. In fact, it is an opportunity for people to seek reconciliation and justice from God Himself. Remember, in every situation, God always has a plan that is greater than what we can see with our naked eyes. Number 6. Prophecy and hope in today's times. Biblical prophecies not only reflect historical events but also have profound implications for the modern world. How these prophecies were fulfilled in the past and relate to what is happening in our own time makes them incredibly important. Let's explore two remarkable prophecies from the Bible about the Philistines, a people who were once Israel's sworn enemies, and how they can still bring us light in the context of modern politics and conflicts. The Philistines in the Bible are known as one of Israel's greatest enemies. Their destruction was clearly foretold in the prophecies of Amos and Zephaniah. These prophecies not only reflect the fall of an empire, but can also find profound connections to current events, especially in the context of conflicts in the Middle East. The prophecy of Amos is one of the most prominent prophecies of the destruction of the Philistines. In Amos 1:6-7, the prophet says, "For 3 sins of Gaza, and 4, I will not withdraw the punishment, because they have driven the whole nation out of the land and delivered it to Edom. I will send fire upon the wall of Gaza, and it will devour its strongholds." These words warn of the severe punishment that the Philistines would suffer for their cruelty to Israel. The fall of Gaza, a key city of Philistia, was carried out through great empires such as Babylon and the Persian Empire. This was not only the end of a people, but also a testament to the sovereign power of God, who never leaves atrocities unanswered. Similarly, Zephaniah's prophecy in Zephaniah 2:05 also speaks of the destruction of the Philistines. "Woe to you who live by the sea, Kittim, this is the word of the Lord to you, Canaan, land of the Philistines. I will destroy you, and you shall not be left alive." This prophecy not only predicts the destruction of the Philistine cities, but also serves as a warning to all who turn away from God. The loss of the Philistines is a testament to God's justice and the inevitability of atonement. Although the Philistines no longer exist as an independent ethnic group, the name Palestine continues to be present in modern political contexts. After the Jewish revolt in 135 AD, the Roman Empire renamed the region of Judea as Palestine to erase the Jewish connection to the land. Today, although Palestinians are not direct descendants of the Philistines, they still live in the area that was once the territory of Philistia, including the lands that are now Israel, the Gaza Strip, and the West Bank. However, the name Palestine still carries a historical connection with Israel's biblical enemies. The modern conflict between Israel and Palestine is closely linked to biblical prophecies about conflicts between the peoples surrounding Israel in the last days. Theologians and biblical scholars often view this conflict in the context of prophecies about opposition and conflict that will occur in the end times of the world. The wars between Israel and the Arab states, as well as the complex relationship with Palestine, can be linked to these prophecies. In Zechariah 12:03, there is an interesting prophecy. "On that day I will make Jerusalem a heavy stone for all peoples. Whoever tries to lift it will be hurt." Although not directly referring to the Palestinians, this could be a reference to the conflicts surrounding Jerusalem, where the dispute between Jews and Palestinians over control of the city has become increasingly fierce, especially important religious sites such as the Temple Mount and the Holy Land. In the last days, Jerusalem will be at the center of global conflict as nations and peoples vie for control of the city. Additionally, the prophecies about the rebirth of Jerusalem and the reunification of Israel can also be applied to modern events. In Isaiah 19:23-25, there is a prophecy that says that there will come a day when Israel will be reconciled with the surrounding nations, including Egypt and Assyria, in a day of peace and restoration. This offers hope for the modern world where the tensions between Israel and the Arab nations, including Palestine, can lead to a future of peace and reconciliation. This hope is not just a wish, but also a promise from God that in the last days, despite all the trials and hardships, there will be restoration and peace. The way these prophecies are fulfilled in the history of Israel and the Philistines can help us to look at what is happening in the world today. The conflicts we see are not random events but are part of a grand plan that God laid out long ago. The story of the fall of Philistia is a reminder that no one can escape God's justice. Every action, big or small, has consequences, and God's justice will always be done. Likewise, when we look at modern conflicts, especially between Israel and Palestine, we need to remember that God's prophecy is not only historical but also of great importance for the future. These conflicts, as difficult and complex as they are, will one day be resolved in the peace that God has promised. It is a promise not only to Israel, but to all who trust in Him. This reminds us that while we may not know God's plan in its entirety, we can trust that He will bring about justice, peace, and restoration. The people of Israel and the surrounding nations, including Palestine, will one day experience a time of lasting peace in unity and reconciliation that only God can bring. The prophecies of the Bible are not just ancient stories but also living instructions for our present lives. We must remember that no matter the circumstances, God always has a good plan for us, and we can trust that He will fulfill all His promises. whether in the past or the future. Number 7. An insight into the Philistines and the Palestinians, lessons from history and prophecy. In the course of history and prophecy of the Bible, the names Philistia and Palestine have always been associated with important events, reflecting in part the relationship between the peoples and the creation of God's kingdom. However, there are apparent differences between these two peoples in terms of identity and role. Although the names may have changed over time, the Philistines were an ancient people, appearing throughout the pages of the Bible, most notably in their confrontations with the Israelites. They lived on the coast of Canaan, most of which is today's Palestine, including cities such as Gaza, Ashkelon, Ashdod, Ekron, and Gath, forming an alliance called Pentapolis. The Philistines originated from the peoples of the Aegean or Mediterranean and were masters in iron smelting, which gave them military strength or superiority over Israel. As polytheists, the Philistines worshipped gods such as Dagon and Ashtoreth and became religious enemies of Israel, who believed in only one God, Yahweh. The relationship between the two peoples was a military rivalry and a spiritual war. One of the most prominent images in the Bible is the battle between David and Goliath, in which the Philistine warrior Goliath was legendary in his defeat. However, despite being a formidable opponent, the Philistines could not maintain their power for long. In the 6th century BC, they were defeated by great empires such as Babylon and Persia. Their cities were destroyed, and by the time of the Romans, the Philistines had disappeared completely. However, the Romans used the name Palestina to replace the land of Judea as a way to erase the Jewish presence and sever their historical ties to the sacred land. The modern Palestinians, a predominantly Arab ethnic group, are descended from the Arab peoples who had long inhabited the area. Although the word Palestine is related to the ancient name Philistia, the Palestinians today have no direct genetic link to the Philistines. The modern Palestinians include both Sunni Muslims and a significant Christian community, especially after the British occupation of Palestine during the Mandate 1920-1948. The modern political conflict between Palestinians and Israelis began with the establishment of the State of Israel in 1948. After Israel declared independence, a war broke out between Israel and the Arab states. Millions of Palestinians became refugees, and the conflict has not ended since. The main issues in this conflict include self-determination, territory, and Palestinian rights in the West Bank and Gaza Strip. Although Palestinians are not directly mentioned in biblical prophecy, the region where they live today is at the center of many important prophecies about Jerusalem and the nations surrounding Israel in the final events of human history. These prophecies can be found in Zechariah 12:03 and Revelation 16:16, which speak of nations gathering to fight over Jerusalem in the last days. The name Palestina, adopted by the Romans after the Jewish revolt, was a strategy to replace Judea and erase the Jewish presence there. The use of the name also reflects the constant changes in power, population, and culture in the region. The modern Palestinians, despite the name of this land, are not the direct heirs of the ancient Philistines. The changing identity and role of these peoples is one of the things that biblical prophecies can allude to, showing a historical flow and change in nations and peoples in the context of God's redemptive plan. Each nation, each name carries within it lessons and prophecies, inviting us to reflect on the relationship between countries and God's intervention in the redemption of the world. These events are not just dry pages of history, but signs of the fulfillment of biblical prophecies, inviting us to realize that history, despite its changes, is always according to God's plan. The history of the Philistines and Palestinians is not just a story of wars and conflicts. It is part of God's grand plan, where each event, each upheaval, carries with it valuable lessons of perseverance, conversion, and restoration that only God can give. The prophecies of these events are not only warnings, but also reminders of redemption and the rebirth of nations, with Israel always at the center of God's ultimate plan of redemption. When we look at the history and differences between the Philistines and the Palestinians, we cannot help but realize that this distinction is not only about ethnic origin but also about the values and beliefs that each group carries. The Philistines, an ancient people who lived in the Canaanite region, fought against the Israelites and are often seen as opponents in the biblical narrative. However, the differences between them are not just about the outward antagonism, but also about the way they lived and worshiped their gods. The Philistines often worshiped foreign gods, while the Israelites, despite many trials, always kept their faith in God. The Palestinians, today, have a complex history with profound influences from different cultures and religions. They not only carry within them a long heritage of the peoples who lived in this land, but also continue the traditions of the ancient Canaanites, with a strong connection to the promises of God in the Bible. Whether we are Philistines or Palestinians, we can all learn lessons about patience, forgiveness, and hope for restoration. God never abandons those who seek His forgiveness and peace. This story also serves as a reminder that no matter how complex or challenging life may be, being sincere and seeking peace with one another will always bring us closer to God's love and blessing. Stay tuned and subscribe to our channel to discover more valuable lessons from the Bible.